Okay, so I am here with a friend of mine, Dave Sivers, who is a great crime writer and a great fan of crime fiction as well as being the co-founder of the Beacon Lit Literary Festival, which I've been to a couple of times now, and is great fun, especially if you live in the area that I do in the Thames Valley. But we're here today to talk about Dave's seventh book. Yes, he's very productive. Seventh book in his Archer and Baines series, and this one's called Price to Pay. But we'll get on to that in a minute. And we're going to start out for people who perhaps don't know your work or you. Let's give us a bit of an idea about how it all started. How did you become a writer? Why did you want to become a writer? And perhaps how did that all sort of evolve for you?
Mm. Well, I always tell people that I blame my mum for me becoming a writer because she was the one who used to read me stories when I was a kid. She was the one who had this great love of stories herself. Always caught her reading a story or whatever, and also taught me to read before I started school. So I already really love stories and reading. And then, of course, as soon as I started school, they started setting us what were called compositions to write. And I quite quickly worked out that these were stories or could be stories. So they always were. So I've been writing basically, literally, some people say as long as they could hold a pen. That's actually true in my case, making up little stories back then. And something that I've just always wanted to do.
So when did you actually start writing, or when were you first published in whatever form? I think you were published as a journalist or a sort of freelance writer before you started doing novels. Is that right?
Yes, I left school at 16 with the three different GCE O levels and drifted into the civil service. Still wanted to write, didn't know what I was doing at the time, so I started submitting short stories to totally inappropriate publications and and scratching my head for a while as to why they were being turned down until the penny finally dropped. But I was all in between what was quite a demanding career. I was sort of writing, and doing an open university degree as well. I was always writing, trying to write books and write other things. First thing I had published was a letter to The Economist when I was about 26, 27, and that was about civil service pay. And they published it, and I was a legend in my own lunchtime in my little corner of Whitehall for about 5 minutes. People used to say, "Oh, is this your letter, Dave?" Yes, it is. Um, and I had various success with some short story competitions and things. I had one short story published in Take a Break magazine under the pen name Melanie Blake. And I've often thought maybe
So what sort of book? Well, what sort of story was that? Was that a crime story?
no, it was a sort of a very short sort of rom-com story. So it had
Ah,
quite a bit of humour in it, and it finished up with these two sort of young people sort of getting together in the final reel. Um, I, it was when I was trying a little bit of everything, and I wanted to try and break into the women's magazines market. I only got that one story that sort of had really hit the nail, and that was one that I'd really sort of crafted away at and had some inspiration for. But I've often thought if I wanted to stop killing people on paper, maybe I could sort of resurrect Melanie Blake and write rom-com novels. Would you believe it?
I couldn't do that. I'd kill someone off on page three, and it would all go
Yeah,
horribly wrong.
well, I think I would as well. But can you believe there's now a rom-com author called Melanie Blake?
There you go. You see, you
Uh,
should have cornered his
yeah,
market
yeah,
earlier.
yeah. And yes,
So I think
I wrote stuff for local papers and local magazines as well. And it was
right.
only after I took early retirement that I started thinking, right, I've got to get these books out there.
And it started, I believe, with what you described to me as crime fantasy, which sounds like something straight out of TikTok. I mean, these days the big thing is romantasy, isn't it? But you were obviously miles ahead of everyone else and were writing crimtasy.
Yeah, I, I, I've always liked reading sort of crime and thrillers and things like that, but also speculative fiction. So horror, love Stephen King. Some of his stuff isn't really horror at all, but I always love his stuff. Liked horror. Not so much sci-fi, but certainly fantasy. And I was a big fan of sword and sorcery for years. So I just came up with this idea for wouldn't it be cool to sort of blend the genres together? So I came up with this private eye type character, though he calls himself a personal inquisitor, and he solves crimes in a sort of a sword and sorcery world. So there's usually a bit of magic involved in them, and it's a sort of a J.R.R. Tolkien meets Raymond Chandler, if you can imagine that.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed writing them. I must write another one day.
Yeah, well, if you've got time. So
Mm.
you switched to contemporary crime, I think, first of all in 2013, is that right? And that's the first of the series that we're going to come on to, the Archer and Baines series. And that was The Scars Beneath the Soul. I think it's a great title. So tell us about how that came about, where the idea came from, and particularly about that pairing of Archer and Baines, who they are and how their relationship has evolved over time.
Okay, well, first of all, when I decided that actually the crime fantasy was a bit of a niche market, and I wanted to write proper contemporary crime novels anyway. And I also wanted to set them into the Aylesbury Vale corner of Buckinghamshire where I live, partly because I'm too lazy to sort of drag myself up to Glasgow or Manchester or somewhere where there's big crime bosses. And partly because I love the area and not enough people know it. I was told that maybe I should be writing cozy crime with old ladies and cats and hats as it was going to be in a nice rural area, but I didn't want to do that. So I knew I wanted to set a crime series in this area. I knew I wanted it to be police because if it's not cozy, it really has to be police. You don't want amateur sleuths bumbling around all over the place. And I knew that I wanted a female detective inspector and a male detective sergeant. And I was still agonising over, well, agonising isn't the right word, mulling over who these characters might actually be. And I went to the Crime Fest book festival in Bristol. It's about 2011, I think it was. And I was in a break between sessions and thinking that I wouldn't leave my very nice seat in the aisle because I've got very long legs, as you know, Cara. I wouldn't leave my nice seat in the aisle and go and get more coffee and more cookies. I'd just sit there. And I'd got a notebook in my hand, and I swear I wasn't thinking of anything in particular. And somehow, it obviously was not a physical thing, but it almost as if these two characters just drifted into the room behind me, tapped me on the shoulder, and started telling me their life stories. So I suddenly, by the end of that 20 minutes, in my imagination, I got, D.I. Lizzie Archer, as she was then, fully fleshed out, and Detective Sergeant Dan Baines, and I knew who they were, I knew what they looked like, I knew their backstory, I knew what sort of characters they were, but they both had a bit of trauma in their lives. Dan's quite a long time ago, and Lizzie's more recently. And I also knew what their first case was going to be. So that was a pretty good 20 minutes work for me, actually.
Yeah, well, I think it'll inspire a lot of people listening to go to Crime Fest. See if suddenly they end up with a successful crime series as a result.
Yeah.
Yes, though I'm interested what you were saying about setting because obviously, especially in a series, I think setting is very important. It can become a character in its own right. And, in my case, Oxford, but obviously there are hundreds and hundreds of examples where the setting plays a really big role. And as you say, not so many people know about the Aylesbury Vale area where you live. So, what makes that a good place to set a crime series?
It's a way of looking at it is that I was once told by Denise Miner, the Scottish crime author, or Mina, I think it's pronounced, that if I really wanted to write gritty crime, I should go up to somewhere like Glasgow and study all the drug gangs and things. And I started thinking, well, that's because it's a big city. And the more I thought about this part of the world, actually, you have got the urban areas. You've got you've got the big town of Aylesbury. You've got the smaller market towns, which are a bit sort of big sort of area type of things, and then you've got the small villages as well. And the village where I live reminds me a bit of the West London council estate that I grew up on, where you couldn't step outside your door and walk down to the shop without bumping into somebody, at least one person that you knew. Everybody knew who you were, and that's not a bad thing, I promise you.
Well, sometimes it's a bad thing in crime.
Yeah, like it could be a bad thing when you were a local kid, but it was not in my case. And everybody used to say hello to each other. People used to look out for each other and help each other. And that's very much what the local communities around here are like. So I got the foundations for something that sort of functioned a bit like a city, but it's got the added bonus of having, it has got the rural areas, it's got the beautiful countryside, it's got an atmosphere of its own, and if you put the whole thing together, you've got really a quite interesting map of the world, and they can go and get involved in something that's happening in a small village. They can go and get involved in something that's happening in a market town, or in a big town like Aylesbury, which is a sort of a shadowy twin of the real Aylesbury in my books. It is a little bit darker, a little bit grittier, and there's an estate there which is notorious in the book, which only exists in my imagination. I don't think Aylesbury's really got anywhere quite like it.
So we'll talk a bit now about Price to Pay, the new one. So how has the trajectory for Archer and Baines gone in the last sort of previous 6 books? And where did we find them at the beginning of this one? And tell us a bit more about that without any spoilers, obviously. We don't want any spoilers. I really enjoyed the book, by the way, for everybody who's listening. I thought it was terrific procedural. So just sort of fill us in on, if you haven't read one of those before, how's the backstory on these 2 people?
Well, in the when the series opens in The Scars Beneath the Soul, Dan has 10 years before this lost his wife to a serial killer, and had his young son, abducted by him. His son's never been seen or heard of since, and the serial killer stopped at that point. Normally, he would have left the body of the child at his next crime scene alongside the woman that he'd murdered. That was his usual technique, but suddenly he just stopped altogether. So 10 years on, Dan still doesn't know what's happened to his son. The killer, known as the Invisible Man's never been caught. And in the meantime, Lizzie, about a year or so before the book opens, has got involved in a confrontation in a pub, tried to break it up, and basically been disfigured by a broken bottle for her sins. And so she decides to run away from where she is and try and rebuild her life somewhere a bit quieter. And she walks into Aylesbury Police Station, filling a detective inspector vacancy. And unfortunately, she's taking a vacancy that Dan Baines had hoped to fill, so they don't get off on the best of feet. And she decides that he's staring at her scar, which she's quite self-conscious about. So again, they don't get off on the best of feet. But by the end of the book, there's some respect and teamwork beginning to grow. And over the series, they've become closer. They've become great friends as well as colleagues. They've always got each other's backs. They're always loyal to each other. They understand each other's problems. And they're a great crime fighting duo. They when they're brainstorming to try and work out what could have happened in a particular crime, they'll be. It's a bit like Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood sort of swapping the lead in a Rolling Stones concert. Only they're sort of chucking.
You're showing your age now, Dave.
I know. I don't care. Who's heard of the Rolling Stones, eh?
Yeah, that's true. So give us a sort of elevator pitch for Price to Pay, just a couple of sentences to whet people's appetite.
Okay, well, by the time Price to Pay opens, both our protagonists have been promoted. So Lizzie is now a DCI, and Dan is now a detective inspector. The book opens with Lizzie outside a courthouse, speaking to the press about the conviction of a young thug for murder, and she receives a threat from his mother. By the end of the day, she's also received a threat from a local gangster who's got a grudge against her. And then later on, a body turns up, and I'm not going to say who the body is, but a body turns up, and the finger of suspicion points at not only Lizzie but her husband Dominic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, that's a really good setup for the book. So I think we've whetted people's appetites quite well there. So that's and a body turning up after all. Why wouldn't it? It's a crime book. But you obviously love writing series because you've got two on the go, and I take my hat off to you on this one because it's hard enough to keep one set of characters in your head, but you've actually got a second series as well, haven't you? So that's D.I. Nathan. How does he pronounce it? Quarrel, like the word, or Quarrel?
Yeah. Nathan Quarrel, yeah.
Quarrel. So tell us about that one because that's not set in the Aylesbury area at all, is it? That one?
Now that's set just over the border in West Hertfordshire, which is where I lived before I lived in Buckinghamshire.
You've got to write what you know, Dave. That's what they always say.
Absolutely, and in fact, a lot of the action in the first book and in the second book actually take place at the Buckinghamshire end of that particular catchment area. So Tring and around there. So Tring's about 3 miles from where I live, so it isn't that far away. But it gives me a chance to have a different force, a different team. And
so how are they different in terms of the characters? What's different about Nathan compared to Lizzie and Dan?
Okay, what's different about him? Well, the main difference about him is that he's not driven just by wanting to solve crimes or by his loyalty to his team or anything like that. He's very much driven by he wants to save everybody. He takes everybody who died on his watch as a basically as a personal failing. And there's the again, I'd be giving away spoilers, but there are reasons in his past as to why that is. Something that he feels he failed to prevent in the past, and so everything that he thinks he could prevent now, he takes it very personally, and he's driven by that, and he gets angry with himself about it. But the main difference between the two series, I guess, is that I mean neither of them are sort of laugh fests, as you know, but the Quarrel books are a few shades darker.
Mm.
And
yeah, well, I get that.
Nightmares, so this is good.
Yeah. So we'll look a bit now at your writing process. So this is a bit more of a generalized, area of questions. And as you know, as well as I do, that every time you go to any sort of festival, whether it's Beacon Lit or anywhere else, one of the first things that the audience will always ask you is where do your ideas come from? So I'm going to be completely conventional and ask you, where do your ideas come from?
Well, I don't know where your ideas come from, Cara, but mine come from everywhere. The scars beneath the skull just popped into my head because I was looking for a case and I thought, well, serial killer would be good. What sort of serial killer could he be? And it was as unthought out as that. But I mean, I've taken inspiration from the local area and thought, well, that'd be a really good place for somebody to die. And I've found little snippets in newspapers that have stirred a thought, and it's not, oh, here's a great case that I can incorporate into a story. But for example, I read something about some crimes that happened in Italy in a copy of the Evening Standard on a train home from London. And I wasn't so much thinking about the case as what would have happened to the criminals afterwards, and to one of them in particular. And so I started to imagine where we will go from there with that particular character. Um, the first Nathan Quarrel book came from being annoyed by some tourists when I was doing a nice, quiet, peaceful walk in New Zealand, and they came past making an awful lot of noise with with loud music playing and all the rest of it. And I'm not giving anything away here. They all had tattoos everywhere, and I thought, oh, I know what I'd like to tattoo on you. And I thought, oh, actually, and I told this idea to my wife, and she said, yeah, it sounds a great idea, Dave, but it's not really an Archer and Baines book. It's a bit darker than that. And I happen to have this character of Nathan Quarrel slopping around in my brain, so I thought, oh, he could do this one, and that was really where he got started. I just think ideas are everywhere.
Mhm. So do you watch true crime? Are you like me and watch loads of true crime TV?
No, I don't. I suppose I should, but I don't. And I watch all the fictitious stuff, which probably is well, I know sometimes is riddled with mistakes and inaccuracies and far
Well,
fetched.
that's a good segue, as the professionals would say, onto the idea of research, which is another thing that we always get asked about. How do you do your research in terms of police procedural or forensics? How do you? I mean, how important is it to you to get your details right? I mean, some people who write crime actually don't care very much about getting the details right. I mean, Colin Dexter famously said he never really spoke to any police officers before he was halfway through writing the Morse series. So some people don't really care, and they sort of make it up as they go along. Whereas I do care, and I spend a lot of time getting it right. But there's no right way to do it. Where do you sit, and how do you get your research done?
I, I mean, because I had a 40-year civil service career. A lot of people say, "Oh, have you got a police background because you write crime?" Well, I haven't. But the civil service grade structure and the police rank structure are similar. Um, we used to solve problems as teams. The police solve problems as teams. So whenever I'm trying to construct a case with my police characters, I start off by thinking, okay, what are they going to need to know? How are they going to find it out? And sometimes you don't need to consult anybody else because you think, well, they'd ask these people first of all. But when you start getting into would they do this or wouldn't they? I do have a friend who's also a police detective, and I go to her and say, "Can I just run this past you? Would they actually do that?" And it's the same with the forensic stuff. A lot of it you sort of vaguely know, or it's not that important. But the big forensic issues that are going to look implausible if you get them horribly wrong, I've got a friend who's a CSI, so I always run the ideas past her. Or I ask her, how would you do this? How would you go about finding this? Um,
Yeah, it's always fantastically useful to talk to people like that, isn't it? Because they're always, and you also always learn something that you didn't know or didn't expect.
and the amazing thing is that everybody that I've ever asked for help with research, whoever they are and whatever they do, they're always very, very keen to step in and be helpful. And in some cases, they'll start even trying to write the book for you. Not so much the police or the CSIs, but one or two other people with particular specialisms.
Well, everybody loves a crime book, don't they? So I suppose we all think we've got a novel in us as well. So on to another question we tend to get asked, which is another generalized one, which is about how you go about it. And obviously the jargon here is plotter and pantster, which for those who haven't heard those before, plotter, do you have a massive synopsis before you start? And I certainly used to be that person. Or pantster, do you fly by the seat of your pants and just sit in front of a blank screen and go, which some people do as well. So whereabouts do you fit on that spectrum, Dave?
I've tried them both, and I think I'm probably a hybrid now. So
I think a lot of people are, by the way. I think a lot of people are, but I mean,
I,
what part of those two things do you
I
like?
start off, well, I start off with a, a stock structure for a mystery novel. Um, here's where I want to put my big twists. What are those twists going to be? And I try and work that out. And once I know what the twists and what the main story points are, then I'll write probably a two-page sort of outline. So that will tell me what happens at the beginning, what happens at the end, what happens around the middle, and how the twists fit into that, and any other key details. And then I just go and write it, basically.
So it's a bit of both. You sort of know where you're aiming for, but in the middle it can go in its own way. And I think that's true for a lot of people, actually. Speaking personally, the last book I wrote for the very first time, I didn't actually know who the killer was going to be when I started, which was a sort of slightly seat of the pants experience, but it was quite fun as well.
I did do one where I changed the killer.
Oh, well, that's interesting because
I was almost at the end of the manuscript, and I thought, you know what, nobody's going to not guess this one, so I just changed it. I took a step back.
Didn't you have to go back and do an awful lot of sort of rejigging because all the little red herrings and things? No, you didn't. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, hats off to you. I couldn't do that. I always find it's a bit like a Jenga tower. You start pulling out one brick, and then eventually, you pull out one too many bricks, and the whole thing falls apart.
I was lucky with that particular book, and normally I wouldn't have been if I wanted to change the killer that late in the story. It wouldn't have been as simple as that. But
so, what's most important to you? What's most important to you, character or plot? Which is always plot.
Character.
Yeah.
Everything that I write is character driven. I'm always
okay.
Yeah. I'm always trying to think how the plots. You can't entirely separate them, can you? Because
no, of course not. But you know what I'm getting at.
The plot's the superstructure of the story. If you haven't got characters that people care about, they're not going to keep turning the pages to see what happens next in the story. And because I write series. The character's always got a bit of a story arc going on anyway. They're always on a journey.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, how would they behave in this situation? What would they do here? What would they be thinking? What would they be feeling? And what direction is this taking them off in for the future?
Yeah, fascinating.
I wanted to write a standalone and see whether that's any different, where the character walks onto the page at the beginning and walks off into the sunset at the end and probably will never be heard of again.
Well, the one thing about that is you can always kill people off and not have any problems coming back to haunt you later.
Now that's true.
Yeah, because you can't really put a serious protagonist in proper peril, can you? Because your reader's sitting there thinking, well, no, he's going to get through it because she's going to want to write another one.
Yeah. Karen Slaughter. Don't know if you've read a lot of Karen stuff, but she suddenly killed off one of the main characters in her first series right up in the final reel of one of her books. And to be honest, I didn't like him, so I wasn't sorry to see the back of him. But it was quite a surprising thing.
Yeah. And that's another brilliant segue, because my next question was going to be about the author's crime, if you like, but not necessarily crime authors that have influenced you. It doesn't have to be a crime writer, but people that you like to read, people that you've been influenced by in terms of how you write or the subjects you choose.
I don't know that. I suppose that. Yeah, I'll answer this in a slightly different way. The author who probably influenced me the most when I was first trying to write crime novels was John Connolly.
Okay.
Because I'd read his first novel, Every Dead Thing. When I thought I want to write a crime novel, I want it to be a mystery. And it wasn't something I'd really tried to do before. And I wanted to try and understand structure. And I'd read this book recently and I've been blown away by it. And I thought it would be quite interesting to go back to it and try and take it apart and see how it worked. And it's very, very, very clever book. And the big twist at the end, you really ought to see coming and you just don't. So that was probably the first thing that influenced me in trying to write crime novels. But if you ask me what sort of people I read, I mean, I used to read a lot of Val McDermid, and I still read any Tony Hill books that she wrote, but I think she's pretty well stopped doing those now. I read everything by Jane Casey, who I think is absolutely brilliant.
Mhm.
And I read everything by somebody called Cara Hunter as well.
Oh God, no, she's no good though. Always disappointed.
But I think you and Jane, they're similar sort of writers to me in that there's a lot of emphasis on the characters. Jane doesn't set all her books in one area, but there's still a lot of emphasis on location as well, and giving a sense
Yes,
of
and she's
place.
doing a series too, isn't she? So she's got people who are very much invested in her two main protagonists. So in that sense, yes, I think we're all in a similar position. So we're coming towards the end of our time now. So I'm going to ask you two questions that I always ask other people. And the first one of those is, if you could only take three books with you to a desert island, so it's a version of Desert Island Discs, so it's Desert Island books, which three would they be?
Oh, no pressure.
Yeah, but the whole point is it's quick fire, so you can't prepare it beforehand.
The Lord of the Rings, Every Dead
Yeah, I'm
Thing,
with you on that one. Yep.
Every Dead Thing by John Connolly,
Hmm.
and oh crikey, an omnibus edition of Cara Hunter. There you are.
Oh, what a nice man you are. Well, like, last time I did this, I was talking to Janice Hallett and she chose a Thomas Hardy. And I said to her, goodness gracious me, you drown yourself on a desert island if you took a Thomas Hardy. I mean, it's hardly
Yeah.
uplifting, is it? Anyways, that's what she chose. And the last question, which again is probably a bit me, but I've been asked it myself. Which crime novel would you yourself most like to have written?
Crime novel.
I'll give you mine just so that you give you a bit of time to think. Mine would be Gone Girl because I just think it sort of started a whole new trend and it was really clever. And there's that massive twist right in the middle of the book, and it's just really well done. So I have writer envy about that one.
I think actually The Hound of the Baskervilles, believe it or not.
Oh wow!
Good old Sherlock Holmes, because it's the one that you can always go back to and enjoy again. And
Yeah, well, I think that's true of Holmes, isn't it? In every way, and some of the Agatha Christie's are like that as well. Even though you know everything about it, you can still enjoy seeing how it's all put together.
I might think of a better answer after you've gone, but
Don't worry, it's fine. It's a good answer. So thank you very much, Dave. That was really interesting, and I hope that lots of people who've heard this will be inspired to go and try your books. And particularly, I can particularly recommend the new one, Price to Pay, which I thought was really really good. So thank you very much.
thank you, Cara.